Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. A Christian watched my episode on refuting Christianity, on trying to prove that Jesus Christ, according to Islam, they're trying to make the allegation that he actually died on the cross. As strange as it sounds, we can see the Quran clearly denies that. But, they start twisting the Quranic scripture to prove that Jesus actually died, even according to Islam, on the specific cross itself. So if you haven't watched the first episode, please watch it. You'll see how I clearly debunk that claim. But in this episode, you'll see a Christian reviewed my video. He tried to make a response. So this is going to be a counter rebuttal to that. And God willing, you'll see at the end of it, they will get totally smashed by the evidence we actually show. So basically, I just wanted to summarize my video. I basically said, A, Jesus will be raised to heaven and ascend to heaven completely in living form without death, because God has power to do all things. And of course, rescues Jesus from the cross. So I'm just doing a summary of exactly the things that are occurring in the Quran and hadith. And in part B, Jesus will be sent back again in his living self back to earth, as the hadith reports. He will live again a natural life. He then will have a natural death, D. E. And this time he will die, but then raised to life as part of the resurrection, just like every other human being, to face Judgment Day. That's basically the sequence. This is what the Quran and Hadith teach. A Christian will try and conflate two separate events into one in order to prove his falsified, crucified narrative by distorting the Islamic position. Now, a Christian apologist by the name of Dennis Wilczak says, and he's trying to now refute my video and so forth. He basically says, well, the closest to the original question so far, he says, so Surah 355 is about the second coming of Jesus. He says, very interesting idea, but not very probable from the context. He says in the 10 verses before, absolutely nothing refers to the second coming of Jesus. So that's just an excuse for not realizing what the Quran says. He says, let's go through the summing up points. And for point A, Jesus will raise to heaven and ascend to heaven completely in the living form without death, because God has power to all things. He then says, Jesus will be raised to heaven. He says that is correct. It says so in Surah 355 and in 4:158 and 355. Jesus still is on earth, so of course it is the future from the perspective of Jesus at that time. He says, according to the video, Jesus is talking about my initial video. He says, according to the video, Jesus is raised to heaven twice, but that Jesus dies twice is not possible in the video. He says, so that is the one many inconsistencies in the video. Now, it's interesting because he says, it's very interesting idea that Jesus will come in the second coming, but that's not really probable. I mean, I'm shaking my head here because as a Christian, he believes in the second coming of Jesus. I mean, how can you turn around and say it's not very probable? I mean, that's absolutely bizarre. And then in my original video, I said Jesus can't die twice because that's pretty much a contradiction, because not even Christians believe that. And I said Jesus dying twice is not possible because Christians themselves don't even believe he died twice. Because, of course, we have the funeral prayer where Jesus comes a second time and then there's a funeral prayer. And I said to him, well, how can you die on the cross and then die in the funeral prayer? And I said to him, Dennis, do you believe Jesus died twice in Christianity? In which case he doesn't have a response to. If Jesus died on the cross in Islam and then he dies in the second time in the future, and in the hadith says Muslims pray a funeral prayer, that would make him die twice. So how does that even fit in with Christianity? You see how these Christians make themselves look like fools? And then my point about how Jesus ascends to heaven completely in the living form. Dennis turns around and says, interesting to read that information, only it is not in the Quran, and I don't know any hadith that says so. So if there's no reference for that, it's an addition to the Quran. I mean, I find that really bizarre and funny, because even according to his Bible, in the book of Acts, and I believe in the book of Luke as well, Jesus was actually taken to heaven in his new spiritualized and physical body. He actually rose to heaven. So it's not something really strange. It's actually mentioned in his own Bible. And it actually says in his own very Bible that the same way you see Jesus going up will be the same way he comes down, again in his physical body. So, I mean, for him to say, oh, it's strange, I mean, his own biblical text says that. And of course, the Quran says ascend to heaven. That's enough. Do you know what ascend means? It means to go up. Does it have to mean go up, which has to include death? No. Similarly, the Prophet Muhammad even ascended to heaven on a burak. Do Muslims believe he died while going to heaven and ascended to heaven? No. Same thing with Jesus. So the Prophet Muhammad goes through the heavens, he goes and meets some of the various prophets and so forth, and he comes back down. Did he have to die? No. So, I mean, it's not something strange. So when the word ascend is put up, it doesn't automatically mean you need to die to ascend. You could basically ascend in your physical capabilities, in your physical body. God has got power to do all things. And it's funny when the Christian says what actually disappoints him is that my initial video, it says that I actually go to the Bible to misinterpret the Bible to fit in with the Quran narrative. But notice the inconsistency. They actually use the Quran to misinterpret it and to justify the position in the Bible. I mean, look at the double standards. He accuses me of one thing while he does the same thing from a different perspective. He then says, critiquing my video, he says, another inconsistency in the video is the claim that Ibn Abbas was taught by Muhammad about the substitution. I guess there is no evidence for that claim, and it doesn't make sense. Then the hadith. Well, if you even watched my video, I actually even use Christian sources, which shows the apocalypse of Peter, Gnostic writings. Now, Christians may say, oh, look, that's just falsified, fabricated, narratives. Well, you could disagree with it. It's still part of history, and it's in the historical text, and it's an early text, roughly between 150 to 200 years, which is pretty much the acceptable codex data. And it's part of the 1st and 2nd century. That's pretty much when most codexes accepted during that date line. And of course, when it goes against Christianity, oh, look, it just suddenly becomes unauthentic. And so, you're asking for evidence of substitution. It's even in your own, Gnostic, Christian. Of course, you call it heretical. It's there. It's in the annals of history. It's documented. And the substitution is also documented in Ibn Kathir's work, quoting Ibn Abbas and so forth, who is, again, the companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He then appeals to Shabir Ali and Adnan Rashid, saying that they don't believe in the substitution theory, and that's an actual lie. Shabir Ali said, and I'll put the hyperlink below this video, where he clearly said that, according to the scholars, that it is a valid interpretation of the events, that there was a substitution. So I don't know where he's going on talking about how Shabir Ali or Adnan Rashid rejected that view. It is valid amongst several views. So interesting. He then says there are 6 different views about Surah 4157. And I said to him, excuse me, you mean commentators with slight small details of opinions? The vast majority view is he didn't die. And the details were things maybe disagreement on issues such as, who was the actual person that was substituted, or how long he disappeared for. The hadith says, maybe for a few hours, 3 to 7 hours, and so forth. And it's funny because he thinks that the Christian view is the correct one out of all of those views. So, he wants to talk about, there are different views in Islam, but then he has his own view according to Christianity. Funny appeals to Shabir Ali, yet Shabir Ali clearly quoted majority of the scholars don't believe he died on the cross. Of course, he will leave that part out. He then tries to conflate it to a bit of a discrepancy. He says, some commentators say that Jesus remained dead for 3 hours, others say 7 hours. And he's quoting commentators. And again, it's not directly from what the Prophet Muhammad said. It's not, it's just basically some historians, commentators, making an opinion on how, if he died or not. But it's interesting because the same book that he uses, the Christian missionary leaves out a particular point. And this is why I thought, wow, these guys are so dishonest. They go to the particular hadith, and they show a different view to show that, Jesus did die. And they're using commentators. They're not using any real hadith or authenticated hadith, right? So, one of the commentators say Jesus remained dead for 3 hours. Another one says 7 hours. But look what else it actually says. I said to Dennis, why are you quoting commentators? We use hadith and Quran, not mere opinions. And the same commentators in another place says, Sergius was crucified in the place of Jesus. Ibn al-Athar forwarded the report that it was Judas, that betrayer, while also mentioning the possibility it was the man named Nathaniel. So notice he leaves that part out where the commentators didn't even know who the actual person was being substituted for Jesus. And they're just guessing. They're saying Sergius, it could have been Nathaniel, it could have been Judas. And so some of them are saying maybe he was dead for 3 hours, maybe he was dead for 7. So it is just, these commentators are just putting all these opinions into it, right? But so why does the Christian missionary leave those discrepancies out? Because they left that part out because it shows that many people were just making all these different opinions about it. So why was the Christian pointing out the part where these commentators believed Jesus died, but then the Christian leaves out the discrepancies on who this actual substituter was? Well, they left it out to show that, hey, we better hide that part of the commentating because it's just getting ridiculous now. These guys are just talking from opinion and nothing's really backed up and they're constantly contradicting one another. So we'll leave that part out for convenience and we'll just concentrate on those commentators talking about the death of Jesus. I mean, how convenient, how tactically convenient is that? How sneaky can a missionary be? And then he started rejecting the hadith. This particular Christian started saying that, we shouldn't take the hadith. Because, the hadith actually says that, and I'll quote you what it actually says, just to put the nail in the coffin. Abu Hurairah narrated that the Prophet, may God praise be upon him, said, he, Jesus, will live on the earth 40 years and then he will die. The Muslims will pray over him and his funeral prayer in Musnad Ahmad and Abu Dawood. This hadith destroys them. The Christians say Jesus, according to them, only died once, and that he will only die one time. But then they say Jesus also died on the cross in Islam. But then how do they solve the issue of Muslims praying Jesus' funeral prayer in the second coming? The Christian cannot say, well, he can die twice, because that would contradict Christianity too. Thus, the best explanation and the most valid is he died once, both in Christianity and in Islam. In Christianity, it is on the cross, as they believe, and in Islam, it's in the second coming where the Muslims will pray for his funeral prayer. And Jesus escaped the cross and went to heaven without death. Now, the only thing a Christian can do is say the hadith is false, but we know the hadith is not false and it's authentic. The most amusing thing is the Christians think that the Quran is not authentic, yet they have no issue quoting the Quran. But if Muslims quote the hadith, it suddenly becomes unauthentic. Well, if it's unauthentic, you should still accept it, because you don't accept the Quran, but you're still trying to give me the Quran with your interpretation. Now, when Dennis understood that he's now really stuck, because he can't turn around and say, well, Jesus died twice in Islam, while in Christianity he only died once. So, they would have to pick he died once, and they can't reject the hadith because the hadith was authentic, and then they can't put a spin that Jesus also died on the cross in Islam. I mean, you can't have him dying in two places. So, of course, what Dennis does is he says, I don't believe the Quran is right. I only try to understand it because many Muslims believe it is the word of God. Well, we also believe that the hadith is inspired and it is documented from the Prophet, because the hadith says, the hadith is basically the explanation of the Prophet. And if the Prophet is explaining something, he is being inspired by Allah to teach it that way. Because the Quran actually says we've sent the Prophet Muhammad to explain what is in the Quran. And now he says, and I wouldn't need to include the hadith. He's now trying to reject the hadith. Christian missionaries use hadith every day to disprove Islam. They try and character assassinate the Prophet. They say all these nasty things. They use the hadith. Women's testimony is not equal to a man's testimony. Where do you get that from? You get that from the hadith, right? So they constantly attack Islam using hadith. But then when we use hadith to refute these guys, they're suddenly saying, oh no, look, we can't accept the hadith. The Christian tries to turn around and say, oh look, so according to the Quran, the explanations are upon Allah and not on Muhammad. Well, we never claim that, Muhammad's explanation is coming from himself. Even the explanation that he receives is from Allah, inspiring through him, teaching him to the understanding of the Quran. So nothing is from Muhammad. Everything that the Prophet Muhammad teaches, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the hadith, the explanation, it's all being taught through Allah. There is nothing that is coming from Prophet Muhammad himself if it's part of the religion. And I would like to conclude with this. This is going to be really fascinating in my conclusion. I find it amusing that these Christians dispute that the Quran does not profess clearly that Jesus was not saved from the cross. But then we have Answering Islam, who actually quote Professor Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar, work disproving the Quranic position that he was saved. So they actually quote Bart Ehrman, and it says, and I'll quote, the vast majority of Muslims reject the crucifixion of Christ because their Quran rejects this historical event. In the Quran we read, and because of their saying, we slew the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, Allah's messenger, they slew him not, nor crucified him, but he was appeared so unto them. And lo, those who disagree concerning are in doubt thereof, they have no knowledge thereof, save pursuit of conjecture. They slew him not for certain. Quran 4:157. And then Bart Ehrman reads this passage in the Quran, And then he comments to say, it is quite clear that this religion teaches its followers that Jesus' crucifixion was just an act of deception on the part of Allah. So look, New Testament scholar is agreeing that Allah was using deception to show that Jesus was being crucified, but he wasn't being crucified. The Quran teaches that Allah deceived everyone to think Jesus was crucified, but that it didn't actually happen historically speaking. So even Bart Ehrman's agreeing that it didn't happen, and the Quran's rejecting that Jesus died on the cross. He says, this claim is very problematic and it flies in the face of the 1st and 2nd century historical data. So he's basically saying this contradicts the 1st and 2nd century historical data. For this reason, the supposed hero of Islam, Bart Ehrman, rejects Islam's position that Jesus wasn't crucified, and he has openly said that he believed Jesus was crucified according to the available data. This comes from Answering Islam. In his work, The New Testament, a historical introduction to the early Christian writings, he states, in any event, Tacitus' report confirms what we know from other sources that Jesus was executed by order of the Roman governor of Judah, Pontius Pilate. So then the Answering Islam team says, so it seems that the hero for Islam agrees with the Christians about Jesus being crucified. This is valuable information and is very useful to bring up to anyone who treats Ehrman as the hero of Islam. And that's the source, and I'll put the hyperlink below this video. And this is the interesting part. So I find it funny as a Muslim, here you are trying to suggest, these Christians are trying to suggest the Quran doesn't say he did not die. Or, they're trying to deny that the Quran apparently doesn't deny that Jesus died on the cross. Yet we have the Answering Islam showing how Bart Ehrman disagrees with Islam that he didn't die on the cross, and what the Islamic records are false for not agreeing to 1st and 2nd century history. Now this hits the Christians, the Christians literally hit a brick wall with this. Now for those Christians who insist that the Answering Islam only brought up Ehrman to show he's not credible for he also disagrees with the Quran, therefore Muslims should not appeal to him. Well, that still backfires because Answering Islam is still to the least quoting a non-biased scholar who agrees with the Quranic version, Jesus did not die on the cross. Yet we have these silly Christians who are trying to get us to believe that Muslims are misinformed about their own text. However, even a learned New Testament scholar accepts the Muslim understanding of the Quran, and in fact, which led to Professor Ehrman disputing the content of the Quran, saying it's not in line with 1st and 2nd century history. Now, is Bart Ehrman, is he really stupid? He can see the text. It's clearly saying he didn't die. He wasn't killed on the cross. And so Bart Ehrman is saying this is false. He did die. But then the Christians are reading that very same text, these other Christians, they're reading that same very text and they're trying to deny that Jesus wasn't killed on the... they're trying to deny that Jesus was saved on the cross. They're trying to deny that Allah wasn't really talking about his crucifixion, that Jesus was being saved, and that the Christians got it wrong, or the Jews got it wrong for thinking they killed him. So Bart Ehrman is even telling these silly Christians, saying, no, the Islamic position is he was saved and he wasn't killed and he wasn't crucified. So an unbiased scholar like Bart Ehrman, who doesn't believe in Islam, agrees with the Islamic position that the Islamic position holds the view that Jesus was saved, He wasn't killed or crucified on the cross. Although he doesn't accept the Quranic position and he holds on to the Christian position that he was killed, he still doesn't disagree what the Quran teaches. Bart Ehrman doesn't say there's a confusion in the Quran. The Quran doesn't really know whether Jesus was killed or whether he was saved. No, Bart Ehrman's explicit. He says that the Quranic position is he wasn't crucified nor was he killed. So why are these Christians now disputing with Bart Ehrman? To say, the Quran is confused about this situation. No, Bart Ehrman is telling them specifically that the position of the Quran is not true and it's false, and that it claims that Jesus wasn't crucified. Okay, so we're continuing this because a Christian actually returned. So I was going to pause the video and stop the video, but the Christian came back, so I'm going to do a counter rebuttal. We'll continue. So the Christian comes back and he says, if you really believe Surah 355 talks about the second coming, you need to explain why Jesus was raised to heaven, then came back, died and was raised again. Oh my God. I've got to bang my head against the wall. Obviously, he was taken away because Jews wanted to persecute and kill him. So God protected him so he can send him again a second time, and that was the broader plan for God, because he wants Jesus to fight against the Antichrist, kill the pigs, and destroy the cross, which Christians falsely accused him of. Then Dennis turns around and still says, how can you come to the conclusion it was about the second coming? Well, we use the hadith literature, that's why. The hadith literature, numerous places says Jesus will descend, he'll come down with two angels, his hair will be dripping wet, according to the hadith, he'll be dressed in white, he'll be in his physical body and so forth, and he will come and fight the Antichrist, he'll pray behind the Mahdi, he will join the Mahdi to fight against the Antichrist. So many events will happen in his second coming. How can you say it's not about the second coming? The hadith actually says, and then he will die a natural death, he'll live, he'll have children. I think he'll live for approximately 40 years, and he will die, he'll have some children. And the Muslims will pray a funeral prayer behind him. So, yeah, you got to read the historical context through the hadith to see that that's what the literature says. That's why we believe in his second coming. Unbelievable. He then repeats himself. He says, that is not the question. He says, we agree that Jesus will come back again. He says, the point is, why do you think Surah 355 talks about his second coming? And again, I said to him, because we believe he will die once, and the only time his death is recorded is upon his second return to earth. He then says, so you understand the word mutawafika as causing to die. He says, not all Muslims have that view, and the context doesn't really fit the second coming. Majority of the Muslims have the view. All of the Muslims believe, actually, forget majority, all the Muslims believe that Jesus will have a second return. All the Sunni Muslims that I know who believe in the hadith believe that he will die in his second return, according to the hadith. So I don't know what he's talking about. This is just some of the views. And I said, mutafaki does mean cause to die. And I said to him, how can that not apply to his second coming? Can you explain this, please? So then he says, it would be better for you to think about how 355 can be about the second coming. That's a great problem for you. And I said, it would be better for you to think about how Surah 355, how it can also apply for his second coming. And again, that's a great problem for you. And he basically terminated his discussion. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for tuning in, and continues to follow us refuting the Christian missionaries on their distortion of the Islamic view. Thank you.